Good evening, and welcome to another Friday Fireside Pipe Chat. Tonight we're going to talk about bourbons. We've got some comments on and some emails asking me to talk about bourbons, kind of like I talked about scotches. So I'm going to talk about bourbons. I'm also going to talk a little bit about kind of differences in manufacturing techniques between bourbon, scotches, and Irish whiskeys. But first, housekeeping. Tonight, smoking a Nording Freehand. And in it, I'm smoking Frogmorton on the Bayou. This is today's actually the first time I've smoked this. I've smoked a couple bowls of it today. And it's kind of an interesting blend. It's a Balkan blend. It's got some Preak in it. Preak is really, when you first light it, you first notice the Latakia. But the Preak in this is a really strong player. And as time goes on in the smoke, the Preak plays a stronger role as a player than the Latakia. So it's kind of an interesting blend. A little different than the Frogs. Still Latakia based, still Balkan blend. Just a little bit different. So I guess the first thing to talk about is, let's talk about some bourbons. So in order for a whiskey to be called bourbon, it has to be made in America. Now there's a little discrepancies, a little bit of discrepancy where bourbon gets its name. Some think it's Bourbon County, Kentucky. Some think it's Bourbon Street down in New Orleans. But Bourbon County, Kentucky is noted to be, by most historians, the beginning birthplace of bourbon and the bourbon capital of the world. The thing to know about bourbon is for bourbon to be called bourbon, it has to be comprised of at least 51% corn. Now the rest of it will be, other things like barley, wheat, different types of malts. And just like rye whiskey has to be 51% rye, Scotch has to be 51% barley. Irish whiskey is also barley. But back to bourbons. There's really three main classes of bourbons. The first one being a high rye. So even though it's 51% corn, it also has a high content of rye, like 30%. This is not rye whiskey. This is bourbon whiskey with some rye in it. And these are things like Four Roses, Bullet, Basil Hayden, Old Grandad. That's good. I guess another group would be called high corn, much greater than 51%. This is like Buffalo Trace, Jim Beam, Wild Turkey. This is your generic high corn, what we call, I guess, more traditional bourbons. You also have high wheat, which is like Maker's Mark, Van Winkle. Now each of these also have like subgroups, like small batch whiskey. And what that basically means is that there's fewer barrels. It's not as mass produced. There's also single barrel, which means that all of the bottling comes from a single barrel. And these are going to be more of the high-end stuff, like the Wild Turkey, Rare Breed, Blanton's, Four Roses single barrel. Bullet also has that. Pappy Van Winkle would be a single barrel. There's also like Rare Breed is also like a cask strength. That's That's like before they water it down. I think it's also worth mentioning that because there was a problem in the older days, in the early 1900s and the 1800s, of people watering down the bourbons, Congress actually passed the law that said it couldn't be less than 80 proof to be bottled as bourbon, which means it can't be less than 40% alcohol. So some top bourbons would be, I think Baron, my dog, might come into the picture. There he is. Baron, say hi to everybody. Baron's our wine writer. Get going. Okay, so go sit there. Maybe some of the top 10 would be like Jim Beam, like the small batch, Four Roses. Incidentally, Four Roses is my brother's favorite bourbon. Bullet, of course, Pappy Van Winkle. I think it's also worth mentioning that all bourbons are distilled one time, whereas Scotch is distilled twice, and Irish whiskeys are distilled 3 times. Now, we haven't spoken much about Irish whiskeys, but Baron's back. He just wants to walk in front of the camera. So, because bourbon is only distilled once, how it gets its sweetness is as the mash is made, they separate half the mash out, and then when they're almost done with it and they've gone through the distilling, that sweet corn mash gets added back in there, and it gives bourbon kind of its sweet taste. Scotch is distilled twice, but during its distillation, instead of putting it in ovens, they basically cook the barleys, they cook the grains over peat moss, which gives it its peaty taste. And I don't know if you notice, it's probably what some people love about Irish whiskeys. It's very, very smooth, very clean, and the reason they do that is they don't cook it over an open fire, they put it in an oven, and so they dry it that way. He's trying to decide what he's going to do. He wants to be part of the video tonight. But go out and try some bourbons. Some of the bourbons, like tonight, I'm drinking a Jack and Coke, Jack Daniels, and in my case, it's Diet Pepsi. Jack is a fine whiskey. It is not a bourbon. It's a Tennessee whiskey. It's a sour mash. Basically made the same way. But they want to distinguish themselves from bourbons, so they call it a sour mash whiskey. Looks like Boxer's going off too. But when I drink Jim Beam, Baron, sit. When I drink Jim Beam, I usually mix that because I think that's not as good as some of the others. Jack Daniels is great, but I like to have it mixed. And sorry about the interruptions. I'm starting to feel like Jeremy Larson tonight. He has trains and planes and everything else. I've got Boxer going off, and I've got my dog walking in front of the camera. This is Baron. Good boys, go lay down. Lay down by the fireplace. But I would recommend, like a, getting any of those. My favorite, like I've said before, is Blanton's. My brother's is Four Roses. Bullet's a great one. Buffalo Trace, Basil Hayden, great bourbons. And what I would smoke with bourbons is I think you can smoke almost anything with a bourbon. Bourbons are really good with not as much of the smoky stuff. I would save that for the scotches. But like tonight, I got a little Perique. Even though I got some Latakia, the Balkan, it's very mild, so it's not as heavy. So I would smoke it with Virginias. Although I would probably, if I wasn't smoking a type of scotch, I would probably smoke like an Irish whiskey with a Virginia, because an Irish whiskey is very, very clean. What I'd like you to do sometime, if you want it, is take a small bit of Irish whiskey, a small bit of scotch, a small bit of bourbon, and taste them, and you'll notice that how sweet the bourbon is. Do you know what the number one whiskey in the world is? I'll give you a hint. Jack Daniels. Number one scotch in the world, Johnny Walker Black. Number one Irish whiskey, Jameson. Although my favorite Irish whiskey is Redbreast. My favorite scotch, it's whichever one I'm drinking, probably Lefroy, Bunnahabhain, Lagavulin, one of the Islay scotches. My favorite bourbon to drink straight is obviously Blanton's, but to mix is actually Wild Turkey 101. I like to mix Wild Turkey 101 with the Diet Pepsi. So that's about it for tonight. Again, sorry about the interruptions. Again, this has been a Friday Night Fireside Pipe Chat. I hope you guys have a wonderful remainder of your weekend. And by the way, in full disclosure, I should say this is a Friday Fireside Pipe Chat on Saturday evening. My wife and I had a lot of things going on last night. We couldn't do it, so I'm filming this. This is Saturday, the 7th of November. So again, I got a little gargle on my pipe. I'm going to take care of that with a pipe cleaner here in a minute. So have a wonderful weekend. God bless. Semper Fi. Hoorah.